When my family and I recently moved to the outer parts of Chicago, I figured it would give us a chance to get my husband and kids away from the fast-paced life in the city. We had done a lot of research on school districts, public transit systems, even potential employment opportunities, so we wouldn't have to commute too far from where we lived. Finally, after a year, we had found a perfect place for the four of us to live, and had found new jobs in the area. The kids were excited because they would finally have their own rooms and a yard for them to play in. It felt like the place was perfect for us. We had been living there for almost a year before we started to notice things that were impossible to explain away. It started with toilets flushing down halls where there weren't people. We would all be sitting in the living room watching television or eating dinner together, and we would hear the toilet flush. At first, we thought it could be a bad seal in the tank, but after replacing the hardware several times, and then the entire toilet, it still happened at least 2 or 3 times a week. Things progressed from there to a number of different encounters. These ranged from hearing footsteps at night walking down the hall. Sometimes they sounded like they were running, but sometimes they sounded like they were walking. They were very light, so I thought maybe my kids were playing around, but every time I would check on them, they would be asleep in bed. I know my daughter complained of hearing giggling and voices in her room and bathroom at night. She was almost 14, which seemed much too old to me to be scared of the proverbial monster in the closet or under the bed, but I didn't really know what else to think. I had never put much stock in the supernatural before. Mainly, I thought it was a bunch of people with overactive imaginations that had convinced themselves they were seeing things that were just not there or had logical explanations. As time went on, our daughter eventually got to the point where she was too scared to sleep in her own room, which meant that it was almost a nightly occurrence that she would grab a pillow and blanket and sleep in bed with us or on the floor. I even tried sleeping in her room one night, trying to show her that there wasn't anything to be scared of. I didn't hear any laughing or voices, but no matter what I told her, she refused to go in her room by herself at night. Then, one night, something happened that made me rethink everything I ever thought I knew about ghosts. My daughter and I were spending a girls' night together and had stocked up on ice cream and cheesy romance movies, which neither of the boys would have any interest in. We had our spread all laid out in front of us, and I grabbed the remote and tried to turn on the television. To my chagrin, the screen remained black. I pressed the button a few more times, but it refused to power up. Figuring somehow it had gotten unplugged, I went and checked the outlet, figuring the most obvious answer was the solution. To my surprise, though, the surge protector was plugged into the outlet, and the red light glowed on it, showing that there was power going through it. I was going to be super upset if the television was broken, because the last thing we needed was the expense of replacing a television we had just bought a few years ago. I checked the power on some of the other things we had plugged in, and they seemed fine, so I tried unplugging the DVD player and plugging in the television, where it had been. Still no luck, though. No matter what I did, the screen remained black. I was starting to think that the evening that both of us had been looking forward to enjoying was going to turn out to be a total dud. Exasperated, I plopped down on the couch, and we both just stared at the television screen, almost hoping it would give us a clue to what was causing it not to work. For some reason, something in the reflection caught my attention. I could see me and my daughter sitting on the couch together, but in between us was the image of a little girl. She had on a little dress and had her head downcast to the floor. She didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the ground in front of her. I looked over to get my daughter's attention, but she already had her eyes fixated on the screen. When I turned back, the spot between us was empty. The little girl had vanished. Our eyes met, and we sat there for a few seconds staring at each other before we both seemed to erupt in a flurry of expletives and hand gestures. Neither one of us could believe what we had seen. Suddenly, all of the weird things that had been going on seemed to make sense, like a puzzle piece falling into place. I think both of us were glad the other was there, because at least we knew that we weren't crazy. Since then, we haven't seen the little girl anywhere, but the activity continues to go on in the house. We think of her as a guest in the house, almost like she is part of our family. With the knowledge that it was the little girl, our daughter has moved back into her own bedroom. I always thought spirits, if they did exist, were things to fear, but now I've come into contact with one myself, I know this not to be the case. Recently, my mom and I moved to an apartment complex together. Being 25 years old, I had hoped to be on my own at this point. Still, due to financial hardship on both our parts, we figured that it would be best for both of us to share living expenses instead of hoping to find a roommate that would be trustworthy enough to pay their share every month. When we did a tour of the place, we both thought we would be happy living there. Even the rent was going to be on the lower end of the price range, which we thought we could afford. It would be a bit of a longer drive to work, but the savings were more than enough to make up for the extra cost of gas. It didn't take a week before things started getting weird. It started with things going missing, only to appear in places that made no sense for them to be. One particular example was when I found my cell phone in the oven. I blamed my boyfriend for doing this, and even after he adamantly denied it, I still accused him of lying to me since there was no one else there. This dissolved into an ugly fight that left us not speaking to each other for nearly a week. Other strange things seemed to plague my mom and me during the first month of living there, too. I had never experienced night terrors before, but they seemed to come out of nowhere almost from the day we moved in. I would wake up to my mom trying to hold me down on the bed because I would thrash about and more than once had hurt myself. There were also cold spots that would appear throughout our place from time to time. The thing that scared me the most, though, happened to me just a few days ago. Frankly, I don't want to be here any longer because I don't think that I'll ever feel comfortable again. I had woken up really early one morning. Stress from the constant experiences had taken its toll, and I never slept an entire night through. I decided to take a shower, hoping that the hot water would help relieve the headache that was starting to build behind my eyes. I grabbed my bathrobe and walked into the bathroom. Walking into the room, I immediately felt something was wrong, but this was a constant these days, so I had gotten used to brushing it off. I closed and locked the door, trying to curtail the building anxiety. I undressed quickly and got into the shower. The hot water felt good, but did little to calm my mind or increasingly frayed nerves. I was contemplating getting out and running a bath, hoping a soak in the tub might do the trick, when through the curtain, I noticed a large shadow standing in the doorway to the bathroom. The door was still shut, and I know that I had locked it, plus I hadn't heard anyone come into the room while I was in it. My boyfriend was staying over that night, but the shadow was way too tall for it to be him or my mom. The water cascading over me suddenly got really cold, stealing the breath from me. I wanted to get out to escape the cold water, but I was more afraid of who or what the shadow was on the other side of the curtain. I sat there, staring at it for about 30 seconds, before the humanoid figure just seemed to vanish. It was like I blinked, and it was gone, as if I had just imagined the entire thing. I could have thought that I was only dreaming, but the likelihood that I could have imagined the cold water, the figure, and waking up seemed pretty remote to me. I had considered it a possibility that the apartment was haunted already. There were too many signs that I had heard of before that pointed to this being the explanation for all of our troubles, but this was the first time I had seen anything remotely resembling a spirit. After the spirit left, the water almost immediately got hot again. The quick change of temperature made it feel hot enough to burn, forcing me out of the shower. I quickly dried off and pulled the robe around me before I ran to my mom's room to tell her what I had seen. To her credit, even though it's still early in the morning, and I'm sure I sounded crazy at the time, she took what I said in stride. Not a stranger to the supernatural herself, she didn't question what I said, which felt better than I can tell you. The next day, we went and got some sage in order to purify the apartment, but as of yet, I still get the feeling something remains there with us. I'm not opposed to spirits being around, as long as they don't mean us any harm or are trying to scare us, but whatever is there doesn't feel like it means us no harm. I fear we may have to move soon if I don't find some way of removing this presence from our home. A few months ago, my family moved to Arizona because the company my dad worked for transferred him to another part of the country. I didn't want to go because it would mean a new school, new friends, basically a new everything. It wasn't something I was looking forward to, but he didn't have much of a choice, so we packed up and moved the family across the country. I've always been a person that likes to sleep with the window open, but where we moved, with the exception of some of the colder months, it is just too hot to do so. Fortunately for me, it is the cooler time of year, and I am able to let in the outside breeze. A couple of weeks ago, I was woken up by the sound of someone walking by my window. We don't live in an area where it would be normal for someone to casually walk by. It was pretty late at night, 1:15 a.m. by the clock on my phone, so it was even more unusual for someone to be taking a stroll around the house. I decided I would be brave and look out my window to see if maybe it was my parents or even my little brother who was out there. I opened up the flashlight app on my phone and shone the light into the darkness. As soon as the light lit up the area outside, the sound of footsteps stopped. I swung the phone back and forth, and no matter what direction I shot it, I couldn't see anyone out there. Really, I should have been more concerned than I was, but as late as it was, I just figured I might have mistaken what I had heard and went back to sleep. It was a couple of weeks later before something else happened. This time, though, it was much worse than just footsteps. I had one of my friends staying over at my house for the night. He had been asleep for just about an hour when I was woken up by the sound of someone crying. It was coming from outside my window, but it was far off in the distance, not anywhere close to where my room was. I just figured maybe it was one of our neighbors and brushed it off and rolled over and closed my eyes to go back to sleep. I had just about dozed off when right outside my window, it sounded like someone was laughing. It sounded almost like they were crazy or something. The thing that scared me the most was that there was no way someone could have moved the distance between where I heard the crying from to then being right outside my window in that short period of time. I went and woke my friend up, not wanting to be alone at the time. She also heard it, and we sat there in the dark, clinging to one another. I was about ready to go get my mom when suddenly, the laughter stopped. I grabbed my phone and crept over to the window. My friend told me not to go, but I was sure it was someone playing a prank on us, and there was nothing we needed to be afraid of. I shined the light outside the window, trying to find out who it was outside that was laughing. I swept it back and forth, but no one was there. Outside my window, there isn't anywhere someone could have run off to and hidden in the matter of seconds that it took me to get to the window with my phone, so it really creeped me out when I couldn't find anyone outside. Both of us were pretty scared at this point, so we decided that we would sleep in the bed together, trying to find comfort in each other. We had barely closed our eyes when a scream erupted from outside the window. It just kept going on and on. It seemed impossible that anyone could scream for such a long time. We both hid under the covers, our hands over our ears, trying to block out the sound, but to no avail. Finally, the sound stopped, and the air was thick with the silence left by the absence of the noise that had seemed as if it would never end just moments before. I slowly peeled the blanket over my head, unwilling to commit to facing my fears. I looked around the room, convinced what had been outside my window was going to be in here with us, having slunk into the room while we weren't looking. Familiar shapes illuminated by the moon outside cast shadows, making the space feel foreign and unwelcoming. I wanted to go and look out the window to put to rest any fears that had crept into my head, but something told me to wait, to keep still. I just knew that if I left the safety of my bed, whatever was outside my window would attack me. So we lay there all night, too afraid to close our eyes for more than a couple of seconds, but we were okay. We were safe. The next day, we told my parents. They told us it was probably a coyote out there, nothing to worry about. I would have considered it a possibility, but my friend was there. We know what we heard, and it wasn't an animal. Now, more than ever, I want to go back from where we came from, back to a place where I felt safe, back to my old friends. So far, nothing more has happened, but I know that at some point, it will come back, and I don't think it will be content to stay outside. I grew up in an old house that my family had shared since the early 70s. Although it was slightly aged, it had its charm. One of my fondest memories as a kid was playing in the backyard that bordered some woods and flying kites in the sky. I just loved to collect all sorts of kites and run the endless span of our yard and fly them as high as I could. When I was 8, I stopped collecting and flying kites. I also quit playing outside as much. I saw something come out of the woods that I could not explain, and it terrified me. One afternoon, my mom had a friend over, and they were hanging out in the kitchen sharing some tea. She'd waved me off and told me to go play outside and get some energy out. I'd plucked one of my kites out of my closet and went into the backyard to try my luck on the almost windless sky. I did get her up in the air. She was shaky and not as high as I was hoping for, but she was up. So I started trotting, hoping that would help get her up a little higher. I caught a glimpse of the sun as a passing cloud moved, and I squinted and trained my vision on the woods in front of me. And that's when I let go of the kite and stared. My vision was still off from the sun's glare, so I was doing my best to try to focus on the trees a little way off in the distance. There was an old man with an upwards curled mustache and a pudgy belly, wearing a vested shirt and some trousers that I knew were not from this era. At first, it appeared that he looked directly at me, then he started walking towards a group of trees a few feet in front of him. His pace was stiff, almost like a VHS tape skipping slightly. Then once he neared the group of limbs, he just faded into nothing. For a moment, I just stood there with a gaping mouth and rapidly blinking eyes. I could not believe what I had just seen. Suddenly, I was reminded of my kite and that I had let go. I peered back up at the sky in search of it when a thunk sounded behind me. I jumped at the noise due to what I had just seen near the woods and turned around cautiously. My kite lay on the ground, unscathed. At that point, I made the decision to go back inside and play in my room for the rest of the time that my mom was having her friend over for. I never mentioned this sighting to anyone in my family, mostly because I was afraid they would think I was crazy, but I highly wondered if I had imagined after looking briefly but directly at the sun. Over the next few months, I had nothing unusual happen until one night my father was out of town and my brother was at his friend's house spending the night. My mom and I were having dinner in the kitchen when there was a scraping sound on the kitchen window. We had a cat at the time, so we assumed the noise was Bella announcing she wanted to be let in. My mother got up from the table to go to the back door when she just suddenly stopped mid-step. I put my fork down and my eyes followed where she was staring. In the kitchen window was the face of an older woman, but not one from this time period. She looked like she was from the early 1900s. My mom gazed over her shoulder at me, and I'm sure I looked absolutely terrified. All I could do was shrug, because words just would not come to my lips. She turned back around to the window, and again so did mine, but the lady was gone. Hesitantly, my mom went to the back door to check for the cat, but she was not there. Can I explain the people that I saw at my childhood home? No. But I do know the house used to be where a house burned down in the early 1900s. I do not have any photos of the owners, only heard that at some point a house was there that burned to the ground tragically. Was anyone harmed? Again, I'm not sure, but I think that some people that inhabited this spot of land before our house was built on it remain there. During the time I was going to college, I had to keep a job in order to pay for extras that my scholarship wouldn't cover, such as books and entertainment. One such job was working at a movie theater. This wasn't your ordinary run-of-the-mill place, but rather an older building that had been renovated multiple times since it had been built in 1908. I basically had to learn how to do any job in the building since my boss was a micromanager and would consistently ask you to do basically anything at any time. I wanted to make a good impression, so I never complained and just kept my head down and did as I was told. My plan to show how dedicated I was to the job worked, and after a few months of working there, he told me that he was going to leave me in charge of closing the theater on my own. This entailed making sure everyone had left, cleaning the place, and prepping the money for the deposit the next day. I was excited that he had recognized all that I had been doing and quickly jumped at the chance. When the last movie was done, 4 of us went in to pick up all of the containers and sweep up any garbage that had been left on the floor. Now that the last movie had played, we could turn on all of the lights so we could see better. The controls for them are up in the projection booth, so I ran upstairs to turn them on. On my way there, I didn't see anyone, so I was definitely surprised when I arrived because someone had already turned them on. I just assumed someone had beat me to it before I'd even got up there. I walked back into the theater, and a couple of the employees were a little shocked to see me. I asked them what was wrong, and they said they thought I was still up in the projection room. When I looked up there, I could clearly see a shadow that appeared to be in the shape of a person walking back and forth through the windows. It was possible that someone had gotten in there, but I was the only person with a key to the room. It just didn't seem likely. Later on that night, I was finishing up the deposit slips for the next day. I had just placed the bag in the safe and was about to leave when I felt something tap my shoulder when I was securing the door. It is a well-known policy that no one is supposed to come in while the safe is open, and I wheeled around, ready to chastise someone for the breach of policy. However, when I turned around, no one was there. I don't know if it was my imagination or if it really happened, but it seemed that the room felt colder than it had been when I had gone in. Down the hall, I heard someone say, "Hello," followed by my name. The voice wasn't familiar, which was the scariest part, because I could recognize the sound of everyone who was there that night, but against my better judgment, I walked out, turning off all the lights when I shut the door. I looked in the direction where the voice seemed to have come from, but there wasn't anyone there. Just me. I turned to lock the office door when I noticed a light coming from beneath the door. I know for a fact that I had shut off all the lights when I left the room, so there shouldn't have been any light coming from the room at all. I wanted to check to make sure, and when I swung open the door, I was stopped dead in my tracks. Every light in the room, including the desk lamp, was on. I hadn't even used the lamp on the desk, so there's no way I could have left it turned on. I walked back in slowly, not sure if someone was playing a trick on me, or there was someone hiding in there. My eyes darted to every corner of the room, but as far as I could tell, I was alone. I walked over to the desk and twisted the knob to turn off the lamp when I caught movement in the doorway. I hadn't heard anyone coming down the hall, but in my surprised state, I felt it was possible that I had just been too distracted to notice. I looked up, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. There in the doorway stood a woman in a flowing blue dress that seemed to have been pulled out of the past. Although you could see right through her body, her edges almost seemed to shimmer in the dim light like they were constantly shifting. I got the feeling she was almost as surprised as I was from the startled look on her face. Neither one of us made a sound. We just sat there for almost a minute, staring at one another. All at once, her face went blank, and the image of the woman seemed to collapse in on itself, and she disappeared. The experience had me shaking, and I basically fell into the seat behind the desk to catch my breath. It was either that, or run screaming from the room, which when you add to it me telling them what I had seen, would have made me come off as a crazy person. I am a person who has always believed in spirits, but my experiences had been limited to what I had seen on television. I was sure that I had just come face to face with a ghost. There wasn't any way to explain what had just happened. I left the office in a kind of daze, lost in my thoughts, trying to figure out if I should tell someone what I had seen. I flipped off the lights and walked down the hall to check the progress they had made in cleaning the theater. When I walked in, 2 people were standing around talking to each other. One of them was a friend of mine who I didn't think would dismiss what I had seen. I walked up to her and was about to tell her I needed to talk to her, and she said she wanted to show me something. She led me over to the emergency exit, where I could see a pair of muddy footprints. It had been raining outside, so it was possible someone could have snuck in and tracked them in, but the thing that was weird is there were 4 or 5 of them, then they just disappeared. It wasn't like they kind of faded. They were clear, and then gone. Someone could have had second thoughts, but they would have left tracks out, and there were none. She then walked up the stairs to the back of the theater, and there on the ground were the same type of footprints, just as clear as the ones leading from the exit. Unless someone took off their shoes and put them back on up here, there wasn't any way to explain the tracks being spread apart like that, but the odds of that happening seemed minute. I broke down and told her about what I had seen in the doorway of the office at that point. Between the shadow in the projection room, the woman, and the footprints, my night had contained more than its share of strange and unexplainable things. When I finally had told her my story, I almost regretted doing so, knowing how it must have sounded. Instead, she told me that there have been a number of employees and customers who have told stories about seeing the exact same thing that I had. This should have made me feel better, knowing I hadn't imagined the entire thing, but it just left a knot in the pit of my stomach. I didn't last much longer at that job. I never saw anything again that could be considered supernatural, but I always felt like I was on edge. Hidden eyes felt everywhere I went, leaving me uneasy all the time. The image of the woman in the door had left me shaken, and I wasn't looking forward to another visit. My manager, when I brought it up, just brushed it off and told me not to talk about it anymore even if asked about it, which leads me to believe he has seen things too, but doesn't want to scare people off. If that is the stance he wants to take, then he can deal with the ghosts. Whenever I see an old farmhouse while I'm driving down a country road, I flash back to the memories I still yearn to explain. It's almost instantaneous. The passing trees will momentarily distract me, and I will marvel at their beauty and leaves. Then, when the farmhouses appear, knots in my stomach materialize and leave me near breathless. The farmhouse of my nightmares once stood in Indiana, a vast landscape that included 50 acres handed down between multiple generations of family. As you can imagine, it housed all sorts of livestock, sported a large barn and orchards. The orchards used to be my favorite place to escape. I'd trot down the rows of trees while the fruits were in bloom and just enjoy the smell of the breeze. I'd bring the bucket in case I was lucky enough to find a perfect ripe apple or 2 to snack on while exploring. One August day, after milling about the orchards, I'd gone back up into my room, which was in the attic of the farmhouse. I was on my bed, flipping through a comic book and drinking a glass of milk. I began to hear footsteps ascending the attic stairs and put my comic down, awaiting someone's knock. However, no one knocked. So after a minute or 2, I went to the door and opened it, but no one was there. Dumbfounded, I trotted downstairs to see if someone needed me. but everyone was out on the porch, chatting and laughing. I was the only person inside the house. I shook the event off and told myself I had imagined it, or the house was just settling, which it often did due to its age. A few months later, it was winter. I was playing with some magic cards I had bought the month before, and my parents and grandparents wanted to drive to town to get a few things from the store. Being 12 at the time, I stayed home by myself. I was playing on the living room floor with my magic cards in front of the fireplace. A log on the fire crackled and I jumped. I shook my head at myself at how silly I'd been and started reshuffling my deck of cards. Suddenly, mid-shuffle, I heard my name being whispered. I stopped shuffling and looked around the dimly lit room. I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. I shrugged it off and shuffled the cards some more. For a while, nothing else occurred. Finally, after about 20 minutes, I was tired of my cards and was putting them back away in my magic box. Then I heard it again. Kevin. I flipped around really fast, my heart racing. The voice sounded like it had come from inside the fireplace. I crawled on my knees closer to the flames and listened. No more whispers, but what I did see was what seemed like a face with hollowed-out eyes appear in the flames. I was terrified. It was not even 10 minutes later that everyone arrived back at the farmhouse from the store, and I was relieved. Everyone piled into the living room and jabbered away, enjoying the fire. I was still on edge for some of the night, but I did not feel like talking about what had happened. For one, I was afraid if I mentioned it, my parents wouldn't think I was up to the task of being left home alone for short periods of time. And for a second, I was pretty sure that they would think I was crazy. I had many more experiences over the years, but the few I've recollected were the easiest to describe. Lots of voices I'd heard here and there, occasional shadows darting out of the corner of my eye, and in the orchards, I would sometimes hear the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves behind me in the fall. But when I'd whip around to look, there would be no sign of anyone out there but myself. The farmhouse was torn down 8 years ago and turned into suburbs, and the land was divided off. I have no idea what haunted the land, but I'm fairly certain that there were things from other time periods that linger.